Are we heading towards a new US-Iran deal or towards renewed confrontation and escalation?
Well, that's a great question, Mona, and I think it depends on the regime. It depends on the mullahs. I would hope it's the latter, of course, or sorry, the former, and not the latter. But I think you have to have deterrence. You have to have peace through strength. So there has to be that threat of force. In many ways, it's the same threat that President Trump used in his first term when he, for example, took out when he dropped out of the JCPOA, which is a very flawed deal. And his sanctions against Iran, for the most part, really worked. They were very effective in reducing the capabilities of the regime in the first term. And so I do think, though, that there has to be negotiations. The U.S. prefers diplomacy, of course, and hopefully the diplomacy will work.
Mhm. Now, while Europe and the other partners of the previous nuclear pact said that it was good enough to build on it, Trump's team insists this must be Trump's deal, not the revival of the GCPOA. Now, is that a smart negotiating posture, or does it complicate diplomacy unnecessarily? What do you think?
I think it's brilliant. I think that would definitely be a red line. The JCPOA only delayed slightly the ability of the regime to acquire to build nuclear weapons, and also it armed the regime, the mullahs, with fresh capital, which they used, of course, to fund their proxies in Hamas and Hezbollah and the Houthis. So, I think in retrospect, it was a disaster of a deal. Why the European countries are still in some way committed to that, I don't understand. But I do think that we saw, the actual effects of the sanctions in the first term were very effective, and those were relaxed, obviously, in Joe Biden's term. And of course, we had 60 billion of fresh capital in the hands of the regime. So I think we've
No,
learned by our mistakes
let me
collectively.
get that clear of what you're saying. You're saying here that the
Sure.
previous pact did not insist on Iran's and how it deals with its money in funding its proxies,
Yeah.
and it was only focusing on the nuclear issue, while this one focused on all files together. Right?
Yeah,
This is what you meant.
that's right. Yeah, that's
Mm.
right. And also the first deal, the JCPOA by President Obama and John Kerry, it only delayed the capabilities of acquiring a nuclear weapon, right? So it kicked the can down the road. So it temporarily, perhaps put on hiatus, although there was not any meaningful testing requirements or inspection requirements. So it was a lot of trust but don't verify. And of course, as I said, it armed the regime to get to some other, rather mischievous behavior besides the nuclear development in funding the proxies. So I think President Trump was smart in the first term to understand that and make sure that they were not able to continue funding their proxy militias. And then, of course, President Biden relaxed the sanctions, also did his best to increase oil prices by being very, very hostile to the U.S. energy business or energy industry. That increased oil prices, which only benefited Putin and then the regime in Iran to sell oil at much higher prices, and we saw how that worked out. So I think this is going to be comprehensive. It will require the regime to stop developing a nuclear weapon. But also it will allow the regime to continue developing economic prosperity so that they can be of aid to their own people, which is constructive and also very important to President Trump.
Well, Mr. Greg, foreign policy outlines a long history of missed opportunities from the
Yeah,
Atoms for Peace era to Obama's pivots in 2013. Can
yeah.
this legacy be leveraged now to build trust?
Absolutely. I think it can. And I think the president does that through economic diplomacy. He would rather do business with our adversaries than fight our adversaries, within reason. There has to be some understanding that that the Iranian regime will not be a threat to our friends, to our allies, or to the U.S. And whether that's firing missiles from the Houthis on American ships or our allied ships, whether that's threatening Israel with nuclear destruction, any of these things are unacceptable, obviously. But if we can get to a point where the arms are down, the arms are laid down, and we're doing business, we're doing economic diplomacy. The president really likes that. He'd much rather do business than do war.
Then let me here talk red lines, right? Iran refuses to halt enrichments, the uranium enrichment. The US wants full cessation. Is there any viable middle ground here?
I don't think so, although I could be surprised if perhaps there is some middle ground where there's, enrichment for peaceful purposes for nuclear energy. I think that's a bit of a stretch. I think the mullahs have demonstrated that they have every intention of developing a nuclear weapon. So I would argue that they have plenty of oil in Iran. I'm not sure that they need nuclear power, but there might be some compromise, and I'll leave that to the diplomats. But I think at this point, it's still, as I said, really important that they don't have nuclear weapon capability.
Now, according to the foreign policy article, the article warns that invoking the UN's snapback mechanism could push Iran to leave the non-proliferation treaty. Now, how real is that threat, and what would be the consequences then?
Yeah, I think that would be a big mistake for Iran to leave the agreement. And of course, that's why we need the threat of the Israelis and the Americans taking out their nuclear facilities. There was some argument to be made when Israel took out other facilities a few months back that they should have gone after the nuclear weapon facilities. They didn't. They chose not to escalate. Perhaps that was wise. But the Israelis, the Americans obviously have the capability to do that. It's not what we want to do. I think that's more of a, perhaps a threat, but it's a credible threat. I think you need peace through strength. You need to have deterrence, and we have that capability. Again, that's not what the Americans want. We want diplomacy, but diplomacy, we want economic cooperation that, again, will be better for the Iranian people who are suffering under this regime and under the sanctions that are necessary because of the regime.
Now, as you wrote about the issue of Israel and its role in the issue, now regional de-escalation is cited as critical at this very particular stage, especially with the Israeli war on Gaza. Now, could a nuclear deal help reduce broader regional instability, do you think?
I think it would. Yeah, absolutely, because that is a very credible threat to Israel and other neighbors as well, other Gulf states and Arab neighbors, but especially to Israel. I think it is a credible threat. If that threat is no longer realistic, then I do think that both parties can move on to some peaceful negotiations. And that's what we saw with the Abraham Accords in President Trump's first term. And those accords have held, which is really interesting. Even after October 7th, the Abraham Accords have continued to hold. It's really important. I think you'll see additional signatories to that deal, to the Abraham Accords. So this is all good news. And as soon as the nuclear capability is taken away, that means that we can move on.
But some of the agreements, were built on the issue of a Palestinian state to alongside with an Israeli one. So it holds as long as the Israeli get back to this. So the question is, would an Iranian deal or agreement reflects on the stability of the region and with terms that can go with all agreements on the ground?
Yeah, I'm not sure that it solves every problem in the Middle East. It takes away one major problem, or I should say two. One is the threat of nuclear war from a regime that's been rather aggressive in the region, and two, it takes away their capabilities to continue funding the the proxies. And we've been very pleased in the last year to see the proxies dial down quite a bit. After the strikes on the Houthis, there was really no particular reaction by the Iranian regime. You had the end of the Assad regime in Syria, and that was obviously a close ally or even a puppet state of Iran. That's no longer the case. You've basically seen Hamas and Hezbollah, defeated for the most part, or at least close to defeated, or no longer being, especially with Hezbollah, no longer being a serious threat. So remember, Israel took 300 missiles from Iran in one attack. They were constantly attacked by Hezbollah,